directors of the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law at Monash University. And the other reason that I'm delighted to be here is because I think this is such an important event, and it's one that I'm very passionate about. And I'm also thrilled because I know each of our speakers and have known them for many years, and I know what a treat you're in for this evening to hear from each of them. But before we get underway, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we've gathered today, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd also like to begin with just taking a few moments of silence for trans people that have been lost too early. And it really does highlight, and I'm sure our speakers will be talking about this further this evening, but it really does highlight the importance of having dialogues like today to try and combat the violence that trans people face on a regular basis. So perhaps just a few minutes silence. Now, we will be live tweeting this seminar this evening, so if you see me on my phone up here on the podium, it's not because I'm not interested in the speakers. I'm in fact so interested that I want to share with other people what they're saying via Twitter. So the hashtag is CC Equality up there, so if you are so minded, please feel free to share your thoughts and impressions this evening. The first speaker that I'd like to introduce is Kenton Miller. I know Kenton because I used to be on the board of the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, and Kenton is a very valued employee there working in the education sphere, and he's made a significant contribution to fighting homophobia, transphobia in Victoria, particularly through education. And as some of you may know, I did my PhD on human rights education. I really think that the key to overcoming many of the attitudes, the discrimination, the hate that LGBTI people face is through education. So please join me in welcoming Kenton.
I'd like to begin by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and paying respects to the elders past and present, as well as any present here today. I'll also begin, thank you Paula for that, good to see you again. I'll pay my respects to my fellow panellists, and by way of disclosure, my friends as well. We just got together, it's hanging out. Thanks to the Castan Centre for this opportunity to share the work that we do at the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. We tend to say the Commission, or we just run out of breath saying that all the time. Particularly around supporting workplaces to reduce discrimination against transgender employees. Tonight I'm going to focus on including our practice guidelines and training and consultancy in corporate and local government settings. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kenton Miller. I work at the Commission as an education consultant. My preferred pronouns are he and him. I'm not a lawyer, so nothing I say can be taken as legal advice, merely information upon which you may choose to act on. The Commission is an independent statutory authority with responsibilities under the Equal Opportunity Act, the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, and the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act. Can I just check, is that loud enough at the back? Most people are familiar with the complaints function that we have at the Commission. We also have an excellent dispute resolution unit. We also have a brilliant research and policy branch called the Strategic Projects and Policies Unit, and our own education and consultancy services that offers training and support to a wide variety of corporate, community and government organisations. The work I'm going to talk about today, the guidelines, are really a bit of a cross-commission or work that we've done. I think we get to see it as we go along. The work's mostly being done by a colleague got in the audience, Julian Alban from our Strategic Projects and Policies Unit, and also with our legal unit under the guidance of Karen Leonard, as well as the education and consultancy services. It's like we all work together in the same organisation. Most of you here know it's against the law to discriminate against people on the basis of actual or presumed gender identity. It's one of a number of attributes protected under the Equal Opportunity Act in certain areas of public life, such as employment or goods and services. When the Equal Opportunity Act was revised in 2010, it also included a positive duty. So there's a responsibility for duty holders, including service providers and employers, to prevent and eliminate discrimination, sexual harassment and victimisation. This means not just waiting for the complaints, but taking real steps to prevent discrimination. As part of our mission at the Commission, to work with others to eliminate equality and build a community that respects and promotes human rights and equal opportunity, we provide practical education and consultancy services to equip people to be able to make this positive duty. This practical support includes our guidelines. These here, there's a couple of copies at the front if you don't have them already. If you have to comply with the law, then how can we help you to do that? Under the law, the Commission may issue practice guidelines on any matter related to the Equal Opportunity Act. And while the law says practice guidelines are not legally binding, it also says a court or tribunal may consider evidence of compliance with practice guidelines irrelevant to any matter before the court or tribunal under the Equal Opportunity Act. So they pack a little bit of weight. There's an onus on them to get them right. One of the issues we became aware of through our work was the need to help workplaces or services to best support a worker who's transitioning at their workplace. How could they respond positively to some of the challenges that might arise when a transgender person accesses their services? It's easy for us to say, don't discriminate. It's a lot more useful to be able to offer guidance and assistance to people and step them through what that actually looks like. Some folks swim in these complexities every day. For others, it's new and sometimes it's a confusing area of life. So this guideline here was co-branded and developed in partnership with TransGender Victoria. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge Sally Goldner and TGV for their invaluable assistance in putting it together, and co-branding. That's pretty useful as well. Yeah. Unlike the guidelines we've already developed around recruitment and sexual harassment, right from the start it was apparent that with these guidelines we'd need to have more of a frequently asked questions kind of approach, especially around specific areas that people had uncertainties about what to do. The publication is aimed at managers first, people who need clear guidance around what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. But we're also aware that trans folk were going to be using it to have a better understanding about what their rights were at work as well. So there was a primary and a secondary audience. We knew that for some people, we'd have to go pretty basic. We'd have to give some background around transgender people in the workplace, explore the issues, explain the law, and most importantly, step out for people what they had to do, the practices they'd need to follow in order to comply with the law. To quote the law again, in preparing practice guidelines, the Commission must consult with persons or bodies that the Commission considers represents the area, or persons to whom the practice guidelines will relate. Well, that's just good practice, really. So we interviewed and consulted with a range of key stakeholders. Organisations, government departments, recruitment agencies, because we want to work with the working bodies as well, other employment bodies, businesses and community organisations that we consider to be subject matter experts. On the one hand, we needed to find out what people didn't know, and we also needed to work out how best to communicate things to them in language that could be understood. What we found at the focus group stage was that lots of people had very little experience in this area, and they wanted examples of where things have both gone wrong and where they have gone right in the workplace, especially around specific issues such as the use of toilets and change rooms or the proper use of pronouns for people, and practical solutions. That's what they're always after, practical solutions as to how to get this right. In the focus group, we sought guidance from participants about how to frame the concepts and the language, not just the legal language, because as our guidelines note, we acknowledge the complexities of language and identity in this area, and the terms we use are not applicable to everyone. We have, as I said before, a magnificent legal unit, but we also have our other units for people who speak a language other than legalese, right, with all due respect. We have to balance being legally accurate, or at least not losing the intent of the law when we plain language it, with the need to also be sensitive to the people that we're referring to when we develop and write these guidelines. For example, we understood early on the importance of not reinforcing binaries. So the law talks about the other sex, people transitioning to the other sex. It became quite clear that we needed to change that to people transitioning to another sex, so that it wasn't just cutting people into two. This was a seemingly small change, but it's one that shows that we listened to our project partners. For a guide that's aimed at people in the workplace or service delivery, those people who may not have actually dealt with these issues before, we knew that we'd have to address some pretty basic myths, fears and bad behaviours. We wanted to bring the level of information back, but not so far that we'd lose some of the progress that had already been achieved. For example, one of our focus group members challenged an example that we used where a trans worker was referred to as it by their workmates and said to us, well, this is ridiculous, what are we, back in the 1950s? But for us, that had occurred in two workplaces that we'd already dealt with earlier that year when we were developing the guidelines. There had also, thankfully, there's also lots of other examples, places we've worked with much better practice in their workplaces, and we're more than happy to share those examples as well. In one of those, a regional council where one of 80 outdoor workers who'd been working there for 20 years announced that they would be returning from their annual leave as another gender. This council was pretty exceptional in the level of support and sensitivity that they showed to all of their workers. Our approach to this work is about eliminating discrimination. An essential part of that is about supporting people not to discriminate. So it's not just for the people who may be discriminated against. People are uncertain about what they can or can't say. They fear being punished or even sacked if they get a name wrong or a preferred pronoun. So what does that mean? I'm going to lose my job. So it's explained to them the difference between being allowed a slip up or two or people being willfully ignorant and discriminatory in their language choices and practices. There's a clear difference. For the record, there were a range of opinions in that country council among the other outdoor workers. They ranged from the unrepeatable through to the utterly supportive. Somewhere in between was kind of, we don't actually understand this, but we know that that's our person. You touch her and we'll smash your head in. Okay, so well-meaning. We were recently engaged, to use another example, by a large multinational organisation who needed our guidance around another worker who planned to return from leave having transitioned. Picture this place as being a very upmarket office with a view over the docklands, okay? Looking for guidance, the Human Resources Manager went online, searched the interwebs and found our guidelines as well as our transition plan questions that we have so that HR, Human Resources can sit down and ask the worker, what do you prefer, when should it happen, what language would you like us to use, and working on that plan with that worker, as well as a transgender policy template that we've got there online for people. It was decided that we would provide training to a range of staff, including the workers' immediate and management team, to address any concerns that they had. The turnaround for the training was a couple of days, and it required us to do some pretty quick thinking and preparation. Here's a quick aside on the use of language. In my early drafts, because I had the job of actually letting these people know that someone they'd worked with for a number of years was going to be coming back to work as a different gender, I had said, for a number of years you've worked here with male name X. From Wednesday, you're going to be working with female name Y. Okay? I ran that past Julian, who said, actually sounds like female name Y has assassinated male name X, just so they can get the job. Right? So always worth running things past other people's eyes. It quickly got rewritten to, you've now been working here with male name X. Male name X has become female name Y, and you'll be working with female name Y from now on. Okay, so worth revisiting. Whilst the training put this process in the context of the law, including the federal protections around gender identity that have been in place since the 1st of August 2013, it had to be more than just the legal stuff. We have to provide a space for the workers' colleagues to be able to process the news of their colleagues' transitions. Not surprisingly, there were tears and there were cries of shock from people who had absolutely no idea, including those who were working closest with their colleague. And we needed to give them space to be able to process this news for them. We supported the workers in their processing, and we gave them the chance to also, at another part of the training, identify issues for themselves. And they came up with questions like, what do I do if someone rings and asks for male name X? What if we're out and the member of the public is abusive? What's the expectation of me stepping in with that? When I speak to female name Y about work we've done in the past, do I say, remember when you were male name X and you did that? You know, so lots of very practical things. And including, I've not met male name X before, because we're talking about a large company, but if I bump into female name Y in the lift, am I allowed to tell her how brave and wonderful I think she is? Well, yes. Don't go all single white female on them, but you know. Just as with the Supportive Council and the corporation to put this entire strategy into place, we're actually finding these days that people are deeply invested in getting things right and respecting their co-workers. That's the big shift we're seeing. This was part of what we also communicated to the firm ahead of time. You might be anticipating some problems, but in this day and age, you should also be anticipating that this may not be the first time that workers have had transgender issues arise in their lives. And it wasn't. In this day and age, more and more people are finding this. And the unexpected outcome for the human resources team of that organisation, it wasn't that 100 more people suddenly felt the need to transition in their workplace, right? It was according that transgender person their respect that she deserved as a member of that organisation. It left all the workers feeling a lot more confident that the workplace was going to handle any of their personal issues a lot better than they had assumed beforehand. As one staff member said openly in one of these sessions, they had never felt prouder to work at their organisation than they had that day. We've done this work enough to know what better practice looks like, and some key bits for us look like this. We should be working with the person who's transitioning to find out what their preferences are, their choice of pronoun, new name, how they'd like people to be told, where the lines might be drawn in personal conversation. As one transitioning worker said in her letter to other staff, as far as asking questions, I'm happy to answer, but if you have a little voice in your head asking if you should ask that question, the answer's probably no. We do this either directly working with the person who's transitioning or through a supportive human resources person, whichever the worker is more comfortable with, and we balance their preferences with the needs and constraints of the organisation as a whole. We need to work out what needs to be communicated, obligations under the laws, organisational policies, behavioural guidelines, some clear guidance and rules for people. We need good leadership in organisations that supports the processes. That has to be there for all supervisors, for all workers who are there, and need to be able to follow up any concerns and address those that might come up as a result of the training as well. Places need to have proper policies and procedures in place to reduce any concerns or doubts. It's probably also good to, a couple of seats just in there, to run separate workshops for the other workers, to allow for venting when it's needed, and not in a way that's going to negatively impact upon the transitioning worker, like that's not going to be useful at all for them to be exposed to that. It's okay to remind people that they're allowed to have a range of feelings or opinions about the subject. It's probably against the law and policy to openly express some of those opinions in the presence of the worker who might be transitioning. Some workplaces, when we've worked with them, have also organised for the Employees Assistance Program to be on standby if there's a need for that as well. Despite how far we've come, there's a lot of work still to be done in the area. For example, recently, we've revisited the language that we use around trans issues because of how it might impact on others. For a while now, and you'll see it in our guidelines, we've talked of transgender people as being people whose gender identity is different to the physical sex assigned to them at birth. This careful wording failed to take into account, however, that for intersex people, that actual process of being assigned to physical sex, especially when it involved any violation of their human rights with non-consensual, non-medically necessary surgery, that has potentially traumatic connotations. A quick revisit, and you'll find in our next set of guidelines for transgender people, that gender identity is listed as being different to that recorded at birth. We have to be open to forever reviewing the language that we use and finding a balance between being correct, accurate, and also sensitive to the need of the people we're working with and referring to. We have to get it right because we're asking others to, and we just have to keep checking on ourselves. Is this right? Without disparaging it as being, flavour of the moment. It's a more respectful process than that. There's going to be a lot more work to do, especially in the future around intersex issues. The laws have already shifted federally in that area, as Australia has become the first nation to offer clear protections for intersex people. We also have another set of guidelines that we're working on, for which the demand has been strong for years, guidance around transgender people and sport. This falls right inside our usual work because we've always been about levelling the playing fields. Look, I've said to Julian once or twice in this process, there's a reason why this hasn't been done before. It's potentially a very tricky legal space and there's next to no case law to work from in any of the examples. Because there's a lack of guidance in this area, people have found themselves in the absurd situation where a backyard cricket club from outer upper nowheresville, when they've got to think about transgender issues, actually looks to the Olympic guidelines for their operational guidance. That's what the lawyers might call a little disproportionate and the rest of us might call over the top. To say that the laws around the transgender and sports have some inherent complexities is to wander off into the land of understatement. I don't want to give too much away because we're hoping to launch these before the end of the year, and I'm certainly not going to get into discussions around strength, stamina and physique, but I will give you the heads up about some of our approach that we're planning with these guidelines. The law around transgender people in sports does have some exceptions built into the Equal Opportunity Act that allow for discrimination. The sports exceptions are there with a policy intent to support fair competition. More than any of our other guidelines though, we have to be looking to medical guidance as well. And we have been consulting with sporting bodies, legal professionals, medical professionals, government departments, players and key stakeholders in the community. Most of the big sporting bodies that we work with are driven by player participation and inclusion in their sports. They want more people involved. We want more people to feel safe when they're involved. Because of who we are, our starting point is going to be inclusion and participation. Our role is going to be to outline both the rights and the responsibilities. I want to finish by saying that at the Commission, we're going to continue in our work to help build fairer and more inclusive environments for intersex, trans and gender diverse people. Perhaps in acknowledging that sometimes the law can be quite complex, it's also this simple, that just because the law says in some circumstances you can discriminate, it doesn't mean that you should. Exceptions should be just that, exceptions. So watch this space for more exciting work from us. Thank you.
Very much, Kenton, for that wonderful insight into the work, the great work that the Commission is doing. And it's really given us a good foundation on which to now build with our next two speakers. And we really are very privileged to have Tony and Sally here tonight to give us the lived experience of trans and intersex people. And can I tell you, it's not always the case. We are really lucky to have these two speakers who are so generous with their time and so willing to share their stories. I was recently at an event in the UK that was promoted as an LGBT conference, and when I asked why it wasn't LGBTI, they said, oh well, this is being organised by the Foreign Office and that's the language that they use. When they then had a speaker just not show up for the conference, they asked me if I could speak about intersex issues since I'd raised it with them. So fortunately I had Anna Brown's recent opinion piece from the Administrative Law Journal that talked about the amendments to Australia's Sex Discrimination Act, and Kenton mentioned them here. They're the first in the world to expressly include intersex. And also I could talk about the implications of the Norrie High Court decision. And so I started to pitch my talk at that level and was surprised when I was getting some really blank stares back at me, and it came out that many of the people at this LGBT conference didn't know what intersex was. and I had to go back and start at a much more basic level. So I think we are in a fairly fortunate position in Australia, although we still have a lot of work to go, and perhaps Tony can share with us some of the stories about what we've achieved, what we need to achieve.
Hello, good evening everybody, irrespective of sex and gender, or indeed intersex status. It's wonderful to be here and to follow my wonderful friend Castan, who does amazing work and has for a long time. He wasn't grey before he started the commission. It's probably true. So my name is Tony Briffa and I am an intersex person. I'm also the Vice President of the OII, so there's two national intersex organisations, Organisation Intersex International and the AIS Support Group Australia, and I'm lucky to be the Vice President of both of them. And I'm here to discuss human rights issues for intersex people. The theme for tonight is Arthur, Martha and everyone else. And I like that theme because I can tell you in 2001, when I stood for Parliament actually, a metropolitan newspaper referred to me as not knowing whether I was Arthur or Martha. Just because I'm an intersex person and I'm an out intersex person. And I remember the first thing I thought when I read that was, my mum has to read that. As if she hadn't gone through enough, having a child that was born, you know, not knowing whether the child is a boy or a girl, having all the complications of doctors pulling her and pushing her one way or the other, about what sex I should be raised, what surgeries I should have, what hormones I should take, what to tell people, what not to tell people. She then has to read in the newspaper that I don't know whether I'm Arthur or Martha. So most people, I hate to say, probably think that when it comes to Arthur, Martha or everyone else, intersex people are probably the everyone else. But that's actually wrong. Most intersex people are indeed Arthur or Martha. Most of us, despite our biological variations at birth, are indeed boys or girls, women or men. We are not a third sex. Some intersex people, like me, are happy being recognised as a combination of Arthur and Martha because our natural bodies are, after all, a natural biological combination of both female and male attributes. But even then, we're not something outside of male and female. We're actually a combination of the two. Intersex is about biology. It's about people born with biological attributes that makes them not exclusively male or female. It's not about sexual orientation or about gender identity. But many of us experience the adverse effects of heteronormativity and sex stereotypes. Intersex people can be gay, can be lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. But most of us are straight and have never had gender identity issues. Most of us identify in the sex that we were raised. So what are the prevailing human rights issues for intersex people in Australia? I categorise the systemic intersex human rights abuses in Australia as breaches to an intersex person's right to physical integrity, our right to provide consent for irreversible and non-therapeutic intervention, the right for intersex people for equal recognition in the law, the right for intersex people to fully participate in society, the right for intersex people to marry and found a family, and the right for intersex people not to be discriminated against just because we were born with a natural biological variation. So I'll speak first about the right to physical integrity and the right to provide consent for irreversible and non-therapeutic surgeries. The current situation in Victoria, across Australia and in most parts of the world is that when a child is born intersex and they have atypical genitalia, which is about 25% of intersex people, doctors make a decision about what the child is going to be raised. Will it be raised as a boy? Will it be raised as a girl? Fantastic. No intersex organisation in the universe has an issue with children being raised as a boy or a girl. In fact, when some states have tried to introduce legislation or have included legislation to identify and recognise a child, an infant, as something other male or female, that is X on their birth certificate, we've been appalled. You don't want to do that. I mean, most intersex people, as I said earlier, you raise them as a male or female and they're happy with that assignment and continue on that for the rest of their lives. But, so doctors make a decision, and the decision is great, but unfortunately they then proceed to surgically enforce that decision. Now there are times, and I really want to make this clear, there are times where there is a medical need to perform surgeries. And I do not have an issue with that at all. If there's a medical need to do surgeries for a child, absolutely. Nobody in the intersex community would say no. But if that surgery isn't medically required, it's done to reinforce the sex that a person is being assigned, is made for the purpose of normalising a person into the stereotype of what a male or a female looks like, then no, you are breaching that person's human rights. What is wrong with waiting to provide for that child to be able to provide consent for any cosmetic surgeries that they might want? And I do want to make the comparison, a direct comparison between the treatment of intersex children and the treatment of transgender children, because I think it's a very important distinction that we make. And we look down the road at Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, and they treat both intersex children and transgender children. Trans children do not have, doctors will not perform surgeries on them to reinforce the sex that child actually wants. Even if the child is guilt competent, so competent they actually can provide consent, the 14, 15, 16, they will not do surgeries. Absolutely not. Hormones, they have to be 16 to do hormones. I think that hasn't changed, has it, Sally? 16 for hormones. 16 for hormones, they have to be adults, 18 for any surgeries. If that child is intersex, however, surgeries can start any time. Hormone treatment can start any time. There is no requirement to get family court approval. It's just absolutely disgusting and an affront to our human rights. And even in other ways of the Royal Children's, that's just one example, but I'll use the Royal Children's given that we are in Melbourne. If you look at the website of the Royal Children's Hospital and you look up gender identity disorder or transgender children, they will have they have a website, they have a page on their website, they have resources with links to trans groups so parents can get support that they need and meet other parents of transgender children, all those sorts of things. If you look up intersex, you will find nothing. Nothing. Not to mention the fact that doctors like calling us disorders of sex development as opposed to intersex. Despite the fact that the intersex community largely around the world do not like that pathologising terminology, doctors will refuse, simply refuse, including doctors at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, to change that terminology to something that's more respectful of us. And so that we're at a law centre, there's Marion's case. So if we look at a High Court decision, Marion's case, it's clear that if surgery is not medically required and if it's irreversible, you shouldn't do it and you need the approval of family court. Well, somehow for intersex children, doctors like to take the matter in their own hands and say, well, you know what, this is medically required. There are a few cases that doctors have actually taken to court. And all of those cases are the most unambiguous cases you can imagine for intersex children, because they're now trying to build a case for these matters not to go to a court, but that they can make a decision through an ethics committee in the hospital. An ethics committee, might I add, that does not include an intersex layperson like most other ethics committees that you'll find in hospitals. And then I should also mention the Australian government and in particular the Senate have just done a lot of work in recent years, and they've got a wonderful report on the involuntary and coerced sterilisation of intersex people in Australia, with a number of recommendations for quite a lengthy inquiry. And obviously it's something that we'd really like to see those recommendations work towards with the intersex community, with the medical community, but a human rights focus, understandably. Then I'll talk about the right for intersex people for equal recognition in the law. So as I said earlier, most intersex people are male or female despite being born with biological characteristics that aren't exclusively one sex. And some of us, a smaller number of us, but it is some of us, identify as being both male and female, or neither male or female. These intersex people, like me, do not have the right to equal recognition before the law. We can't get a birth certificate. We are the only class of people in this country that cannot get a birth certificate to recognise what we are. So I can have, and I've had a birth certificate in Victoria that says that I'm female, that I'm male, and that I'm blank. But despite all the medical evidence, and I've got doctors from the Royal Children's Hospital, I should mention, that are very happy to attest that, yes, Tony Briffa, born with an intersex condition, blah, blah, and is therefore biologically male or female, I cannot actually have male or female put on my birth certificate. Even passports. Now, passports in this country, I could get a passport that says that I'm M, F, or X. Don't know why I would want an X, but I can. But I can't get one that says that I'm M and F. And I'll tell you what the problem with X is, because a lot of people, including intersex people, think that X is a great idea, and it was celebrated when it happened. But the problem for me with X is that you're either male, you are either female, or you're something else, a third category, which is X. And that's not the story, because you're actually somewhere, you're a combination of M and F. You're not outside M and F. So I personally don't like the X. And then, of course, we have the Marriage Act in Australia that says marriage is between a man and a woman to the exclusion of all others. Last year, I'm very pleased that my wife and I were able to get married in New Zealand, where two people can get married. And there have been moves in Australia. There's the Recognition of Foreign Marriages Bill, for example, that the Greens put up recently. And even that bill, in trying to recognise and be inclusive marriage equality, sadly actually excluded intersex people, because it spoke about recognising marriages between a man and a woman and a woman. And the Greens have been very good in saying that they're happy to change that. But on the face of it, it actually did exclude people like me who are outside that. I mentioned passports. I do want to mention birth certificates again, because unfortunately birth certificate legislation in the ACT was changed so that intersex infants in the ACT can get a birth certificate that says, rather than M or F, you could give them an X. Now, that legislation was put through without the support or without the consultation of the intersex community. Before it was passed, we met with the Attorney General and explained the issues with them, but sadly it wasn't changed. So we are hoping that they'll use a lot of discretion in the way that legislation is implemented. Then I talk about the right of intersex people to marry and found a family. And again, obviously, speaking about the Marriage Act, for example, we can't, well, we can marry, but we have to pretend that we're one or the other. So, for example, to marry my wife, I could have married her in Australia if I pretended to be male. But why would I do that? And why would I deny who I really am and open myself up to the risk that later on down the track, my marriage will be invalidated if I'm run over by a bus or I end up in a hospital and they realise, oh, this one's not really a boy, or if we end up in a nursing home and we're older or something like that. I don't want to look behind, and I don't want to lie. I am who I am, and I'm okay with that, very okay with that. And then I talk about the right not to be discriminated against just because we were born with a natural biological variation. Now, thankfully, I do have some good news to report, and that is, last year, Australia became the first and only country in the world to include the attribute of intersex status in our anti-discrimination laws. This means that we now have some protection from discrimination on the basis of the biological variation intersex people are born with. Certainly we're pushing for that to be replicated in the State Act. Currently the Act does provide some protection for intersex people, but only on the basis of gender identity. And even then, even though the language was very progressive in its time, and I think it was about 2000 when it was introduced, it speaks about intersex as being of indeterminate sex, and obviously that will change. So we're looking forward to the Equal Opportunity Act Victoria to be amended and include the attribute of intersex status. And then I talk about the right to fully participate in society. In addition to all the issues mentioned above, which limit the rights of intersex people to participate fully in society, intersex women in particular face considerable discrimination when it comes to participating in sport. And I commend the Equal Opportunity Commission for all the work they've done for transgender people in sport, but not much is done today for intersex people anywhere. Not just Victoria, but anywhere, and certainly not banging the Commission. The Commission, fantastic and very inclusive. But it's just, we're getting there. We're slowly getting there. A report from the UK this year, unbelievably for women, intersex women to participate in sport, required women to have their clitorises reduced surgically to be able to compete as a woman in a sport. Now, I'm not talking about, you know, I'm just talking about, you know, large clitorises. Unbelievable. Others have been told that their natural testosterone levels are too high to be considered female, and therefore will have to have their gonads removed or other hormonal intervention to modify their own natural hormone levels. It's incredible. We have made some progress in recent years, but yes, we still have a long way to go in Australia. The government must implement the recommendations of the Senate report on the involuntary and coerced sterilisation of intersex people in Australia, and consider the recent comments in the Senate report to the Recognition of Foreign Marriages Bill 2014. That report, incidentally, I highly recommend people read the Recognition of Foreign Marriages Bill committee report, because it was wonderful in recognising the issues that intersex people face. It was in the majority report, all three parties, including the chair who's a Liberal, recognised the issues, and they really gave intersex community a very good hearing, actually, so I really want to commend them for that. And they recognise there is a lot of work to be done for intersex people. As a community, I would like to see more people become aware of what intersex is, and for them to become our allies. Indeed, I would also like to see more GLBT groups become our allies and be genuinely inclusive of intersex, and not just including us when it's convenient, or dumping intersex issues because they either don't understand intersex issues or because they don't care about intersex issues. And finally, I'd like to thank the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law and Monash Uni, and Paula and Marius and everybody for inviting me to speak tonight, and for giving intersex people a voice. I'd love to see more of it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm pretty confident that there's no one in the audience that didn't learn something from Tony's presentation. And if you do want to find out more about intersex, the Monash University Ally Network had a launch not that long ago. We were privileged to have Phoebe Hart speak at that event, and she has produced a wonderful documentary called Orchids, My Intersex Adventure, and really provides great insight into the secrecy that can so often surround intersex, and how she wasn't told until she was a teenager that she was intersex, or that there was quite a strong history of intersex within her family. And then as a filmmaker, when she wanted to make a documentary, there was a lot of resistance from her family about, no, we don't talk about this stuff, we certainly don't want it on film. So, you know, it is great that we have people like Tony who are so open and comfortable and confident and to come out and talk and play that educative role for people. Our final speaker today is Sally, and Sally and I met, I think, certainly well over a decade ago in the Amnesty Queer Group. Another person who has been a wonderful spokesperson for minority group. She is the Executive Director of TransGender Victoria. She is a presenter of 3CR's Out of the Pan. She is nominated or listed as one of the Age's top 100 most creative and influential people. And what's not on her bio, but I think it's very important, is she comes and talks to my students about transgender issues in my human rights master's classes. So please join me in welcoming Sally.
Thanks, Paula, and I too would want to reiterate an acknowledgement to the original inhabitants of the land and pay respects to elders past and present. And at a function such as this, I also like to acknowledge our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex elders and acknowledge their unique contribution to diversity and intersectionality on this land, including sister girls and brother boys. So, I had to try and find a subheading for my talk tonight. If trans people ruled the world, in a benign, sharing way, of course. What would we do if we wanted to cross all the T's, so to speak? There's lots of things to talk about, and I decided to put them under 4 headings. And the interesting thing was that when I was given about 20 minutes, I thought, I'm not sure if I can keep all the things that we still have to do into 20 minutes. And that's, of course, of concern. Tony covered lots for intersex. There are parallels between trans and intersex, so I'll put an eye on the time and make sure that I don't go too far over that 20 minutes. Or better still, as I look at Paula, who's probably got the watch on me, to stay within it. So, I will start just by pulling a definition of trans in there. There is much debate about this, but trans, or sometimes now trans and gender diverse, are people whose sense of gender identity or gender expression differs from expectations given the sex that was recorded at birth. And I'll acknowledge Tony's comment on recorded. I think that's a fair one. And so what does that mean? I'll use myself as the proverbial guinea pig, that I was born with what clearly appeared to be a male body at birth. It was therefore expected I would identify as male and that I would have a more masculine form of expression. I didn't meet those expectations. I tried really hard for 29 and a half years to be a heterosexual, masculine, football-loving, beer-drinking male, and I failed on all 5 counts. And it was nothing to do with the fact that it was a case of supporting Richmond, but on the football front. But so on the serious side, I was trying to be someone I wasn't. And this is, of course, the critical issue for trans people. We need to be who we are. And I think very strongly that, I'll say in the longer term, obviously acknowledging with respect the blip that has been the last 48 hours or so in terms of some media reporting, people are beginning to understand that basic tenet of trans and gender diverse existence. They understand that people need to be who they are, and we're getting to a point where we are having some understanding of, okay, that has implications for policy and things like that. But there are differences within the differences. I call it diversity within diversity, and there's still distance to travel. So I want to outline that tonight. Just before I launch into that, I'll try to be up to date for the tweeters as well as the hashtag CC Equality, at TransGender Vic, and at SalGold said so, which is my personal hashtag. So as I say, 4 or 5 key areas. These are definitely not in any order of priority. Documentation, which Tony touched on, is definitely an issue for trans people. We've had some degrees of progress over the years, but in Australia we still have the situation that about 9 states and territories that look after birth certificates, and I admit I must have missed a class in school because I didn't know Norfolk Island had a parliament of its own until very recently. We only have 1 of those 9 that will do trans and gender diverse birth certificates based on affirmed identity, and that is, as of April this year, the Australian Capital Territory. I found out at a conference in Sydney a few weeks ago that Canberra wants to be the leading GLBTI capital city in Australia. Well, I'm sorry, I'm a proud Melburnian, I'm not going to have that. So hashtag friendly rivalry, but we have to catch up. Seriously, all of the other 8 states and territories, apart from the ACT, still are based on a surgical basis, and that is not relevant or appropriate for many trans and gender diverse people. We discovered that some years ago that the Monash Gender Dysphoria Unit surveyed its trans women clients, and only around 25 to 30% of those people completed surgery who had made a permanent affirmation of their female identity. So if you don't need or want to do that, or you can't have surgery because of other medical conditions, that leaves you in a state of limbo. And so yes, I still, at this point of time, as someone born in Victoria, have male stuck on my birth certificate. And sure, I'm reasonably happy about where my life is as a person now, I'm confident, but it still creates anxiety. Last year, when TransGender Victoria started an anxiety and depression discussion and support group, I needed to get a Working with Children's check. So I gather my documentation, hop into a post office, and I realise I'm handing a birth certificate over the counter to a total stranger that says Sally Goldner, male. A small eek moment. It was pleasing to see, actually, only last night someone posted that on Facebook a photo of a registration for Working with Children's check online, where they at least have male, female and some sort of third option. And that, I think, is a sign of progress, that people are looking at it. And I think that came out of one of the other good reforms at a federal level from 2011 to 2013 being the Sex and Gender Guidelines, which worked on 2 principles: getting markers off forms and things where they're not needed, but if they are from a trans and gender diverse point of view, doing it on the basis of affirmed identity. I think there's a strong argument to say, why do we need a marker at all? I'm not a total forensic expert. I try to watch LA Law and Law and Order, but and get accurate information. But I would believe there's ways other than sex or gender identity that can be used to identify people. One could argue whether socially or not, the aim of having a marker on a birth certificate is about marriage, which I'll touch on again shortly. But let's have birth certificates, if we've got to have a marker on things, based on affirmed identity, and a very simple change process, simply signing a form that says this is a true declaration. The ACT process requires a letter from a GP, as does the federal process of passports since September 2011, which is a large step in the right direction, but it's still perhaps not as ideal as we would like, but that would be livable. And so, certainly not the requirement of surgery or hormone treatment. And the new birth certificate needs to be without previous names or previous markers. That can be a privacy invasion if that's the case. And there also needs to be the ability for minors, those under 18, to change their birth certificate with the approval of at least one parent or guardian. And I have had people come to me in the last few months saying, well, I have affirmed my identity as a teenager. I'm wanting to go for a job for the summer holidays, and they've asked for a birth certificate. I now have to out myself, and there isn't, to my knowledge, an alternative form of recognition that would work. And even if there was, if some company says, well, it must be a birth certificate, what happens? This also creates other issues. It could lead to someone being inadvertently outed at school. We are seeing, happily, young people affirm their identity earlier, and that is an issue. There's also issues possibly for school injections. If someone, how do we work through that? That's an issue in itself. So we would like to see the principles of the federal sex and gender guidelines adopted in all states and territories as well, and across all sectors, private, non-government organisation, and government at all levels. And so that's the main areas of documentation. There is, of course, crossover in the 5 main headings I'm going to talk to, and so the second area is, of course, anti-discrimination law. And one that's a pretty easy thing and a sensible thing would be to update the Victorian definition that was introduced in 2000 to the federal definition introduced last year in 2013. The federal definition is concise, it is less jargonic. Apologies to Viroc's legal department who are here. It's simpler, it doesn't tie people to their recorded sex at birth, it covers non-binary identities, it covers expression. And I haven't even heard any grumbles from within the trans and gender diverse community on that definition, so I think we've got a winner there. And so it would be very consistent to do that for trans and gender diverse people, but also for business, for government, for everyone, if we have consistent definitions across all jurisdictions. It would be nice if all of our 10, I've got to count again, 9 governments cooperated on this, but obviously we can probably see this being somewhat of a one-by-one approach. And we would also echo on a similar note the need for the federal intersex definition to be included at state and territory law, again for ease of consistency, if not anything else. The other areas though come into exemptions, and one that we haven't touched on so far is the exciting area of religious exemptions. I say exciting because it always arouses passions. And there's all the arguments about freedoms versus other rights. I cannot see, and the current thinking is that if it's someone's genuine belief to discriminate, or a religious organisation's belief to discriminate, they need to have that right. Being a nice Jewish girl who spent 13 years at an Anglican boys' school, I know a little about religion, but I haven't heard of any religion yet that says that it's in their scriptures that says it's a religion's right to discriminate when they get government funding. I haven't seen that in Isaiah, or in Genesis, or in the New Testament either. But on a serious note, what are the consequences of such discrimination? Well, we hear a bit about it in a report that at the time tonight was released a few weeks ago. This is not just holding my piece of paper up, it's a fantastic piece of research called From Blues to Rainbows, available at glhv.org.au. And it talks of much of the discrimination faced by young trans and gender diverse people, but at the launch we heard the story of Eric Locke, a young person of Vietnamese origin who is also trans. Eric spoke about his experiences on 2 levels, one at a religious school which was claiming to use the exemptions. Eric needed to affirm his identity. He stopped wearing skirts and started wearing trousers, and on the 4th day the principal decided to discipline Eric to the point where he locked Eric in an office but with glass windows that looked onto the hallway so everyone could see Eric in there as they walked past. Now, there is no law even allowing for the religious exemptions that can excuse that sort of humiliation, probably false imprisonment. I'm not an expert lawyer, but it certainly sounds like a massive violation of rights in my book. Well, one wonders, had those religious exemptions not existed and the principal had to do the right thing under equal opportunity law, whether it ever would have got to such an horrendous position in the first place. And so if someone can explain how that is justifiable, how that fits in with someone's religious beliefs, well, then you can sell me the Westgate Bridge, but I'm not really going to believe you. And so those religious exemptions are way too broad, they're way too hurtful, and ideally meant to be abolished or looked at on a much more case-by-case basis. Kenton touched on the sport situation, and this is another major area of exemptions. both in Victorian and federal law, and in most of the other states and territories. Tasmania is a notable exception to the exemptions in that they don't have them, and got rid of them some time ago. And credit to a fabulous Tasmanian trans advocate, Martine Delaney, who's also a round ball football player who recently won an award for her club and is someone I deeply admire for her persistence in standing up for trans people in many ways. But as Kenton touched on, the current sport definition and exemption leads to some very bizarre scenarios. As stated, I can't find a definition of the word competitive in terms of competitive sporting activity. And this has led to the story of a trans woman at a local golf club who was told, yes, you can play as a woman if you just roll up for a scratch round on a Saturday and turn up at the first tee, but you can't play as a woman in the pennant competition because we're deeming that competitive. Is that high farce? Yes, it is. And this can be continued, and I legally await any sort of report or recommendations that can get past that sort of scenario. Golf is difficult enough as it is. I was once asked what my handicap was and said my game, but I don't think seriously that anyone should have to go through that sort of stupidity just to get some sport and some exercise and get some enjoyment. The other issues, and I'm touching tonight on both what I'll call direct statutory legal discrimination and also perhaps more subtle or social forms of discrimination in all of the areas I talk about. A couple of other areas, it is still not 100% clear that we have the best practice in terms of dealing with trans people in custody. And we would prefer really on that an individual case-by-case approach. And we can't really do ground rules on this. Hormones take time to have effect, and some people may need to be moved. If we're going to have a custody system that is based on a binary basis, then we're going to have to allow for some degree of flexibility. And the other area of discrimination, which Tony touched on again, parallel, is marriage. Trans people face issues similar to use the exact term, the cisgender population in terms of people who are other than heterosexual. Cisgender being people whose gender identity meets expectations given what was recorded at birth. But we face, some of us face the additional issue of dealing with a situation where a trans couple who have married, with one with an M, one with an F on the birth certificate, they still love each other. One person, say the person who started with the M on the birth certificate, realises their need to be their true self as something other than male, or say female, and yet because of the mishmash of laws that we have, the provisions in our federal constitution that say in the event of an inconsistency, federal law overrides state or territory, that some people have interpreted this to say that even though the trans person has the required surgery, they can't change their birth certificate until they're divorced because that will, in inverted commas, create a same-sex marriage. That is clearly discriminatory. It's legal discrimination, it's social discrimination, it's financial discrimination. If they have to divorce, that then means people have to go through the costly process of divorce, loss of things like possible superannuation benefits as a married couple. The simple solution is to have a federal marriage act that recognises trans people that recognises all couples, including where one or more, both people are trans, as a loving adult couple. No ifs, no ands, no buts. And whilst there has been a move, and the ACT again has been the leader in ending so-called forced trans divorce, to amend all the states and territories laws seems like a very long way around. Let's just get federal marriage law done and dusted. The third main area is medical health and medical needs of trans and gender diverse people. And probably one of the biggest issues is that currently there are large out-of-pocket costs for trans healthcare, particularly in relation to surgery, and these need to be zeroed out. Now, I deliberately focus on the outcome here. I'm open to any legal and ethical means that can achieve this. If I happen to, for some reason, be visiting America and bump into Bill Gates and he says, oh, I've got a spare 30 billion lying around, set up a trust fund and the interest can pay for trans medical costs, I'm not going to knock it back. Point is, that's not very likely. Not the least of which I haven't got a current passport, so I'm probably not travelling to America. The likely option, therefore, is publicly funding that out-of-pocket gap for surgeries, which for trans women, for their lower surgery, is estimated at $15,000 Australian to have it here. It can be more given for trans men, given multiple operations. And there also needs to be an urgent need to get this done in the public hospital system. Currently, it is not being allowed, and I find that, whilst not a legislated piece of discrimination, to be outright discrimination. And I think maybe it might be time that one state or territory took this to their ombudsman to see if that could be challenged. Tony also touched on the issue for young people, the so-called puberty delaying medication. We did have a win just over 12 months ago, July 2013, where young people did not have to go to the family court for so-called stage 1 reversible medication, and that was very welcome. It was deemed that that was not altering the body in a permanent way, wasn't needed therefore to have that family court approval. But it is still necessary, as discussed, for trans people who want irreversible hormones to go to the family court at 16. We believe that Australia is the only known country in the world to do that. We're currently investigating as much as we can on that, but really don't care whether we are or not. It needs to be stopped. A body is a body anywhere in the world, and we have a very solid record of success in this process around the world. I'm only aware of one possible case where a minor has regretted going down a hormonal path, and that's anywhere in the world. And so I think that any blocks on this have far more detriments than they do checks and balances. There also needs to be an education of health professionals, both at the student level and at the existing health professional level. I would like to acknowledge Azil Aiden, who's done great work with the University of Melbourne Students Association in getting GLBTI as a whole on the agenda. Also people at the Monash, students who put together a presentation that was recorded and hopefully will be on the net very soon. But it's only scratching the surface, and trans and gender diverse, for that matter all of LGBTI, needs to be in the whole medical curriculum, not tucked into an hour in a corner at best. Similarly, there needs to be development of training modules for existing health professionals. We are aware that such health professionals are busy people. The approach that was suggested by the Australian Medical Association, College of Practitioners and others was to do a 15 to 20 minute online module that GPs could get continuing professional development from. And we would certainly be seeking funding to develop that module for a range of health professionals. And the services need to be appropriate for both trans issues that trans people face, such as coming out and providing hormones, but also where it's not a trans issue. If I go to a doctor because I've sprained my ankle walking my dogs, that's my idea of exercise, don't really play golf that much anymore, I don't want to spend 15 minutes talking about trans issues. It's about the fact that I've got a sprained ankle, should I get a heat pack or an ice pack or just take some aspirin? I don't want to do a free education session. It also does TransGender Victoria out part of our income, and that's not fair either. And the last critical area, which would be in a way the ultra preventative of this, would be funding for trans organisations, whether it is advocacy, education, social and or support. Excuse me. The fact that there is no core funding anywhere in Australia for trans organisations, with the exception of the New South Wales Gender Centre and to some extent the ACT Gender Centre, is inadequate. Every time TransGender Victoria does training, whether it's our aged care training or whether it's our own trans-specific training, people are just so thankful that they know how to deal with it. They then end up knowing what they need, knowing what they know, rather than knowing that they don't know. And Kenton spoke about this too. People just need a chance to have a safe environment to learn how to do it right. And it is a highly successful, collaborative, non-confrontational approach where people get a chance to ask their questions. And so we need that as well. And also to focus on the diversity within the diversity, we are needing research on groups under trans. We are finding, particularly whilst there's been progress on trans for male and female, those other than male or female, non-binary, not wanting to have a gender identity, people are still puzzled by that. Trans people who work in the sex industry, trans, multicultural, all these issues need, to be more further detailed. So there's a lot to do. We've come a long way, but we can go further. We want to go further, and we're looking to work with people to do it, and we look forward to doing that. Thanks.
I think what all our speakers have really illustrated this evening is how fixated society in general is with just having male and female. And I'm reminded of a story I heard of a customer at a bank who wanted the bank to say, stop coming to Mr. Jim Smith. And they said, okay, do you want Mrs. or Ms? No, I just want Jim Smith. No, sorry, we need to specify, Mr., Ms., whatever. But they couldn't just send it to the name. That was too far outside of their range of thinking. So I think we do have a long way to go, and the stories that we've heard tonight have really highlighted that. I believe all our speakers are willing to answer some questions from the audience, and we've got a few minutes to do that, and we've got a roving microphone. Oh no. No roving microphone. Just stand up and speak loudly. We'll start down the back.
Hi, I'm another Tony, and I'm not a lawyer, so this is just a grassroots question. To address to Kenton, you talked about the work of the Commission and what it does between an employer and their employee. Does the Commission get involved with organisations and versus their clientele and the public? And what role is there in the way of education and rights? And I'll give you an example here. It's a fairly straightforward one. Trans people get occasionally affronted using one or other of the toilets. Okay? And let's take the case of in a shopping centre that is owned by a private company. What rights are there, and to what extent does the Equal Rights Commission have in that sort of situation? And I've got a second part to that too, is how does a trans person verify their gender identity if they are questioned?
The second question is a really interesting one as to whether or not we should even have to. When you tell a person that you are that gender, that should be taken at face value. If you're clearly identifying on a genuine basis as that gender, that should be accepted. We have the same, it's an odd parallel to draw, but we have the same issue when people have assistance dogs here in Victoria. You don't need to actually have a sign that says this is my assistance dog. You have a disability and it assists you. Then that should take that at face value. The equal opportunity, bearing in mind, I'm not a lawyer, but it covers, the Equal Opportunity Act prevents discrimination in a range of areas of public life. Included in that is goods and services. So where there are services provided to the public, such as in a shopping centre, the same rules around discrimination should apply. And toilets can be, public facilities can be a vexed issue, because the easy answer for lots of people is they can use the disabled toilet, they can use the accessible toilet. Now if that's the person's choice, and it's useful for them to do that, then that's an okay way to go. It's not a choice that should be imposed upon them, though, especially when that might feel as if you're being told that you have a disability, that the conversations we've had that you don't fit. In one of the workplaces that we worked at recently, the option was given to the transitioning worker, where would you like to actually, which toilet would you like to use? And she actually said, I'd rather use the accessible toilet because the women's toilet is at the other end of the building. And I don't know about you, but if I was practicing in New Hills, I wouldn't want to go that distance myself. But it was also a lot cleaner than men's toilets. We know what they can be like. So I think in terms of raising a quick ad, we're completely free. You can call our dispute resolution line. We'll take that on board, and we can contact and deal with the shopping centre, for example, and say, look, this issue has been raised and we need to have concerns. We need to talk this through and see if we can come up with an outcome around that. Is it?
Yeah, that's right. And I guess sorry, I'm from the legal unit of the Commission.
She is a lawyer.
That it's complaints like that can also be a really important opportunity to engage with the shopping centre, for example, and get them to provide some education to their staff. So it doesn't always have to be about taking somebody off to court, but it's a good mechanism to engage with people and have better outcomes from a systemic perspective. So everyday experiences for people are better overall as well.
I'd just like to illustrate part of Sally's talk about marriage by just relaying my personal experience. A friend and myself transitioned within a year of one another. Okay? They were already in a heterosexual marriage. Consequently, they are still considered male. They went off to Thailand, as did I, and went through all that. But they are still considered, they cannot change their birth certificate because they would have to get divorced first. So that person is still considered legally, I suppose, male. Myself, I was in a gay relationship for 30 odd years. When I transitioned, my partner came along with me and stayed with me, and then we got married. So we're married. Now, I can't see anything more absurd than that. That was one of the very few times in my life that being gay, I was gay, I lived a gay life, that was the persona I used, had any advantage. So now myself and my husband are married, and I'm legally in every form female. But my friend is still trapped. It's not right, it's just the absurdity of it.
And thank you for pointing that out. It just shows the whole absurdity of
It's
the binaries.
everything you can, every word you can use to describe something that's stupid and silly can be applied to that situation.
Totally, and I'm glad thank you for speaking up and putting it on the record, because again, it's another example of the absurdity of the current marriage situation. So, yeah.
And it's only for being a married woman.
Sorry? Yes.
Well, if you're in the situation of, that I'm in, you can't marry anybody
No.
at all.
In Australia.
In this country.
It should be between two people.
Two people.
Any other markers? No, it's two people.
Anna?
Just quickly on that, I mean, it's so absurd because you can't actually get divorced either, because in order to get divorced you need to say to the court that your relationship is irretrievably broken down, and it simply hasn't. So you either commit fraud and get divorced, and then
That's just another level of absurdity.
But I just had a question for Tony, and thank you to Sally and Tony and Kenton. As always, it's a pleasure to hear from you all, even though it's not the first time, obviously. I mean, it strikes me, and you're much better placed to answer this, that we need to do more in terms of collecting, obviously, documented examples of forced surgeries on intersex infants and understanding better what the problem is. I mean, we've got the Senate Committee report, but do you see a need for, and is this something we should be working towards, trying to get more research, academic research done and documentation of how widespread the problem is, when's it happening, when's it not happening, longitudinal studies for outcomes in certain circumstances being better than others and that type of thing.
Getting that data is vital. So yes, absolutely we need that qualitative data. What we also need is for people to talk to each other. As a result of that Senate committee report, let's have it funded, have intersex organisations, the medical community, so the Australasian Paediatric Endocrinology Group, sitting at a table together with some people that are actually aware and have a good understanding of human rights law, and say, okay, well, what are the issues? And we can thrash it out. I am very confident that by sitting down together with the medical community, we can resolve the issues. The medical community are good. They're great at their craft. They're great with what they do, but they don't particularly see things from a human rights perspective. And that's what is missing in the conversation. So let's all get together. But it needs to be funded. It needs to be managed by the Department of Health and the Attorney General's Department, actually preferably so both. Get the parties together and let's start working together. Even things as simple as working together as an intersex community and the medical community to put together some brochures for parents so they've got information about their child's intersex variation and what it means and what they can do. Something as basic as that would be a great start to get the dialogue happening between the intersex community